James Adams had everything a man could dream of: money, power, and a luxurious lifestyle. As the heir to the Adams hotel chain, he had never wanted for anything. At just 27, he was already living in a grand mansion, driving the finest cars, and spending his nights in exclusive clubs. Yet, despite the wealth that surrounded him, he felt a deep emptiness inside. His fortune had attracted plenty of women over the years, but their interest was always the same: his bank account. Not once had he met someone who cared about him for who he truly was. One evening, James sat in the dimly lit bar of an elite country club, nursing a glass of whiskey. Across from him sat his childhood best friend, Kevin, someone who had known James long before the world recognized his last name. As the two men talked, James sighed, running a frustrated hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I'll never find someone who loves me for me," he muttered. "Every woman I've met has only cared about my money." Kevin took a sip of his drink, thinking for a moment before raising an eyebrow. "Then why not take money out of the equation?" he suggested. James gave him a skeptical look. "And how exactly do I do that?" Kevin smirked. "What if you disguised yourself and worked at one of your own hotels? Nobody would know who you are, and you'd get a chance to meet people who see you as just another guy." "Not a billionaire." James scoffed at the idea, shaking his head. "Me? Pretending to be a regular worker? What would I even do?" "Anything," Kevin said with a shrug. "Front desk, maintenance, even housekeeping. Nobody would expect a millionaire to be scrubbing floors or answering guest complaints. It'd be the perfect way to see how people treat you without the influence of your last name." At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. James had never worked a day in his life. Why would he start now? But as the night went on, he found himself unable to shake Kevin's suggestion. The more he thought about it, the more it intrigued him. What if this was the only way to meet someone genuine? Someone who wouldn't be blinded by wealth, who would fall for him as a person and not as an heir. By the time James got home, the idea had taken root in his mind. Lying in bed in his extravagant penthouse, he stared at the ceiling, contemplating his next move. He had spent years searching for something real, and if going undercover at his own hotel was what it took, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth a shot. The next morning, with his mind made up, he set out to put his plan into motion. This was going to be the start of something completely different. The next morning, James Adams woke up with a newfound sense of purpose. He had made up his mind. He was going to go through with Kevin's idea. If he wanted to find someone who truly loved him for who he was, he had to strip away everything that made him the wealthy heir to the Adams hotel chain. But before he could begin, he had to get approval from the one person who ran the business with an iron fist: his mother, Linda Adams. Linda was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had taken over the family business after James's father passed away. She had built the hotel chain into a powerhouse and had spent years grooming James to take over one day. When he walked into her office and told her about his plan to work undercover at one of their hotels, her reaction was exactly what he expected: pure disbelief. "James, have you lost your mind?" she asked, setting her reading glasses down and narrowing her eyes at him. "You've never worked a day in your life. What makes you think you can pull this off?" James took a deep breath, trying to make her understand. "Mom, I'm tired of people seeing me as nothing but a rich man's son. I need to do this. I want to experience what it's like to work, to connect with people who don't see a walking bank account when they look at me." Linda studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, she leaned back in her chair. "You're an adult now, and I can't stop you from making your own decisions. But remember, James, everything in life has consequences. Be sure you're ready for them." With his mother's reluctant blessing, James wasted no time putting his plan into action. He chose a hotel in a city far enough from his usual circles to avoid being recognized. If he had gone to one of the family's hotels in the city where he lived, people would have known instantly who he was. Instead, he packed a single suitcase, left behind his mansion, and moved into a small, modestly furnished apartment, his first real taste of living a normal life. The first night in his new apartment was strange. There was no staff waiting on him, no luxury amenities, no grand dining hall with gourmet meals prepared by top chefs. Just him, a simple bed, and a tiny kitchen. But rather than feeling out of place, he felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in his life, he wasn't surrounded by wealth, and it felt freeing. The next morning, James arrived at the hotel for his first day of work. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, he looked nothing like the billionaire heir he truly was. Walking through the grand lobby, he took in every detail: the polished floors, the soft lighting, the hum of guests checking in and out. It was strange to see it from this perspective. He had grown up knowing he would inherit this empire. But now, he was just another employee. At the front desk, he was greeted by Melissa, the hotel manager. She was in her early 30s, with blonde hair and a warm, professional demeanor. Her friendly smile put him at ease immediately. "Welcome to the team, James," she said, extending a hand. "I'll be showing you around today." As she led him through the hotel, James listened intently as she explained how everything worked. He had always known the business from a corporate standpoint: profit margins, expansion plans, and high-level strategy, but this was different. Here, he was seeing the day-to-day operations, the people who kept everything running smoothly. "This is the reception desk," Melissa said as they stopped in the lobby. "It's a busy place, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to interact with guests. Think you can handle it?" James grinned, nodding. "I'm ready for the challenge." During the tour, James met several of his new colleagues. But one person stood out: Edward, the maintenance manager, a man in his late 50s. Edward had a calm, wise presence about him. When he shook James's hand, there was an immediate sense of sincerity. "Welcome, young man," Edward said, his voice steady. "If you need anything, just let me know." James appreciated the kindness. Over the years, he had met plenty of businessmen who only cared about profits and power. But Edward was different. There was something real about him, something that reminded James of the type of person he wanted to become. By the end of his first day, James was exhausted but strangely satisfied. He had checked in guests, handled minor complaints, and even helped a couple plan their anniversary dinner. It was a completely new experience for him. But instead of feeling out of place, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As he walked back to his apartment that evening, he thought about the journey ahead. He had taken the first step into an unfamiliar world, and while he knew it wouldn't be easy, he also knew one thing for sure: this was going to change his life in ways he never expected. James's first week as a hotel employee was an eye-opening experience. He had stepped into this role thinking it would be a simple experiment, an undercover mission to find genuine connections. But as the days passed, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. The work at the front desk wasn't just about checking guests in and out. It was about problem-solving, patience, and learning how to handle people from all walks of life. Some guests were polite and appreciative, while others were demanding and entitled. He had always known hospitality from a business perspective, but experiencing it firsthand was something entirely different. One of the biggest challenges James faced was adapting to the fast-paced nature of the job. Guests would arrive in waves, sometimes frustrated from long flights or lost luggage, and it was his job to stay composed and make their experience as seamless as possible. He quickly realized that even the smallest details mattered: a warm greeting, a smooth check-in, or simply remembering a guest's name. It was a level of service he had never truly understood before. But the job wasn't all stress. Over time, James began to form real connections with his coworkers, especially Edward, the maintenance manager. Edward had been working at the hotel for years, and his calm, steady presence made him someone everyone trusted. Despite his humble role, he carried himself with wisdom and dignity, something James greatly admired. During one of their breaks, James found himself sitting in the hotel's small garden, enjoying the rare quiet moment when Edward joined him. "You seem to be adjusting well, James," Edward said, settling onto a bench. "Most new employees take a while to get the hang of things." James chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I won't lie, it's been a lot harder than I expected. I've always stayed at hotels, but I never really thought about the work that goes into running them." Edward nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "Most people don't. That's the thing about life, sometimes. You don't appreciate something until you experience it from the other side." James took in those words, feeling a weight of truth behind them. He had spent his life on the receiving end of luxury, never thinking about the people who worked tirelessly to make it all possible. For the first time, he saw things differently. As the weeks went by, James and Edward grew closer. During their breaks, Edward shared stories from his past, life lessons, and advice about people. James found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, James admitted something that had been weighing on him. "You know, Edward, I've had a hard time trusting people," James confessed. "Growing up with money, I never knew who was genuine and who just wanted something from me." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "That's understandable. Money changes the way people see you. But let me tell you something, real relationships, whether they're friendships or something more, aren't built on wealth. They're built on time, trust, and how you treat people." James let those words sink in. He had spent his life searching for authenticity, but maybe he had been looking for it in the wrong way. Here at the hotel, as an ordinary employee, he was starting to understand what it meant to build relationships based on something real. At work, James also found himself drawn to Melissa, the hotel manager. She carried herself with a sense of confidence and warmth that made people respect her. Unlike many of the women he had met in high society, Melissa was down to earth, hardworking, and genuinely passionate about her job. She had a way of making people feel seen and valued, whether it was encouraging an employee after a tough day or personally checking in on guests to make sure they were comfortable. James admired that about her. One evening, after a particularly busy day, James and Melissa found themselves alone at the front desk, finishing up some paperwork. "You're really getting the hang of things," Melissa said, glancing up at him with a smile. James grinned. "That's high praise coming from you. I've still got a lot to learn, though." She laughed softly. "We all do. That's the thing about this job, you never really stop learning." James found himself wanting to ask more about her, to understand what drove her passion for hospitality. But before he could say anything, a guest approached the desk. And just like that, the moment passed. Still, something had shifted. James wasn't just here to prove a point anymore. He was here to learn, to grow, and to figure out what truly mattered in life. And whether he realized it or not, the friendships he was forming, especially with Edward and Melissa, were beginning to change him in ways he never expected. As he walked home that night, he thought about Edward's words. Maybe finding real connections wasn't about searching for the perfect person. Maybe it was about being patient and allowing the right people to come into his life naturally. And, without even trying, that's exactly what was starting to happen. As the days turned into weeks, James found himself more at home in his new role at the hotel. He had mastered the art of checking in guests, handling complaints, and even assisting in unexpected situations. But the biggest surprise of all wasn't the job itself, it was Melissa. Melissa, the hotel manager, was unlike anyone James had ever met. She carried herself with a quiet strength, balancing authority with kindness. She was the kind of leader who led by example, never asking more of her employees than she was willing to do herself. Whether it was stepping in to help during a rush at the front desk or checking in on housekeeping staff to ensure they had everything they needed, Melissa had a way of making people feel seen and valued. James admired her work ethic. But more than that, he admired the person she was. She didn't care about money or status, she cared about people. And the more time James spent with her, the more he realized how rare that truly was. At first, their interactions were professional, quick conversations in the hallway or during team meetings. But over time, those moments grew longer. They started chatting during their coffee breaks, sharing stories about their lives. James found himself looking forward to those moments, hanging on to every word Melissa said. One evening, after a long and exhausting day, they found themselves alone at the front desk, finishing up paperwork. The hotel lobby had quieted down, the last of the guests having checked in for the night. Melissa let out a sigh, stretching her arms. "What a day, I swear. Some guests think we have magical powers." James chuckled, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, like when that guy demanded a suite upgrade because he didn't like the vibe of his room." Melissa laughed, shaking her head. "I can't make this stuff up." For a moment, there was silence between them. But it wasn't awkward, it was comfortable. Like the kind of quiet you only share with someone you truly enjoy being around. James hesitated before speaking. So, what made you want to run a hotel? Melissa thought for a moment, her expression softening. Honestly, I've always loved the idea of creating a place where people feel at home. Even if they're miles away from it. I guess that's what hospitality is about, making people feel welcome. No matter who they are or where they're from. James felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had never thought about hotels in that way before. To him, they had always been a business, a luxury to be maintained and expanded. But to Melissa, they were something more. What about you? Melissa asked, tilting her head. Why did you decide to work here? James hesitated. He had prepared for this question. But now that it had come up, he found himself struggling to find the right words. He couldn't tell her the whole truth, not yet. I guess I just wanted a change, he said finally. I've spent my whole life surrounded by wealth and business. I wanted to see what it was like to be on the other side of things. Melissa nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. Well, whatever your reasons, I'm glad you're here. James smiled, feeling his heart race just a little. Me too. As the days went on, James and Melissa's bond only grew stronger. Their conversations became more personal, more meaningful. He learned that she had always dreamed of traveling the world but had never had the time or money to do so. He told her about how, despite having access to everything, he had never felt truly free. One afternoon, they sat in the hotel cafe, sipping coffee as they watched the rain pour down outside. You know, Melissa mused, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. I think I'd start with Italy. James raised an eyebrow. Italy? She nodded. There's something about it that's always fascinated me. The history, the art, the food. I'd love to just get lost in a little town somewhere. With no plans, no schedules, just living. James couldn't help but smile. That actually sounds perfect. Melissa looked at him, a small smile playing on her lips. What about you? If you could go anywhere, where would you go? James thought for a moment before answering. Somewhere no one knows me. Somewhere I could just exist without expectations. Melissa studied him for a moment, as if sensing there was more to his words than he was letting on. But she didn't press. Instead, she simply nodded. I get that. And she did. That was the thing about Melissa. She understood him in a way no one else ever had. But despite their growing closeness, neither of them dared to acknowledge what was happening between them. There was something unspoken lingering in the air, a tension, an anticipation. It was in the way their eyes lingered on each other just a second too long. In the way their hands almost brushed when passing something back and forth. Edward, ever the observant one, noticed, one afternoon, as James helped him fix a leaky faucet in one of the guest rooms. Edward smirked. You've got that look in your eyes, son, he said. James frowned. What look? Edward chuckled. The look of a man who's falling for someone. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Is it that obvious? Edward nodded. Only to those who've been there before. James hesitated. What if she doesn't feel the same way? Edward gave him a knowing smile. Love isn't about rushing things. James, let it happen naturally. If it's real, you won't have to force it. James took those words to heart. He knew he was falling for Melissa. There was no denying it. But he also knew he had to be patient. And so, he waited, not because he was unsure of his feelings, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted something to be real. No wealth, no titles, no expectations. Just two people finding their way to each other. And deep down, he hoped Melissa felt the same way. As the weeks passed, James found himself thinking about Melissa more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just admiration anymore, it was something deeper. He caught himself looking forward to their conversations, seeking her out whenever he had a free moment, and feeling a spark of excitement whenever she smiled at him. He had never experienced this kind of connection before. For the first time in his life, he was drawn to someone not because of wealth, status, or convenience, but because of who she was. One morning, after weeks of stolen glances and unspoken feelings, James decided it was time to take a chance. He found Melissa in the hotel cafe before her shift, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to her table, trying to act casual. Morning, he said with a smile. Melissa looked up and smiled back. Morning, James. You're up early. Figured I'd get a head start on the day, he said, then hesitated before adding, actually, I was hoping to ask you something. Melissa raised an eyebrow. Oh, what's that? James swallowed his nerves. Are you free tonight? I thought maybe we could go out, watch a movie, grab some dinner. No work talk, just a night out. Melissa blinked, clearly caught off guard. James braced himself for rejection. But then she smiled, a real, warm, and slightly amused smile. Are you asking me on a date, James? She teased. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I guess I am. Melissa tilted her head, pretending to consider it. Well, that depends. Are you going to make me split the check? James laughed. Absolutely not. In that case, she said, closing her phone and finishing her coffee. I'd love to. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Great. I'll pick you up at 8? Sounds perfect. That entire day at work, James was distracted. Every time he caught a glimpse of Melissa, his stomach did a little flip. He had been on plenty of dates before, extravagant ones, filled with high-end restaurants and luxury events, but this felt different. He wasn't taking her to a 5-star venue with private dining. He was taking her to a small local cinema and a cozy restaurant. And for the first time, that was exactly how he wanted it to be. By the time 8 o'clock rolled around, James was standing outside Melissa's apartment, feeling more nervous than he had in years. When she opened the door, he nearly forgot how to breathe. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a simple, elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty. But to him, she looked stunning. You look beautiful, he said before he could stop himself. Melissa smiled, a faint blush creeping onto her cheeks. Thank you, James. You clean up pretty well yourself. They took a taxi to a small, independent movie theater in the city. The film was a romantic comedy, something James wouldn't have picked on his own. But he found himself enjoying it more than he expected, mostly because of Melissa. Watching her laugh, seeing the way she reacted to certain scenes, it was like seeing a whole new side of her. Halfway through the movie, their hands accidentally brushed as they reached for the popcorn at the same time. Neither of them moved away. The moment lingered, unspoken but understood. After the movie, they walked to a cozy little restaurant just down the street. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and intimate. The kind of place where people came for good food and good company. This is nice, Melissa said as they settled into their booth. You didn't strike me as a low-key date kind of guy. James smirked. Maybe I've been going about dating the wrong way all this time. Melissa chuckled, shaking her head. I like this, though. No pressure, no expectations. Just a good night with good company. They talked for hours over dinner, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and even their fears. Melissa told him about how she had always wanted to open her own small business, a cafe or a bookstore. Something that felt personal. You'd be great at that, James said sincerely. You have a way of making people feel comfortable, like they belong. Melissa smiled, touched by his words. Thank you, James. That means a lot. After dinner, instead of heading straight back to the hotel, they decided to take a walk through a quiet park nearby. The night air was crisp but pleasant, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. They found a wooden bench under a large oak tree and sat down. The silence between them feeling natural, not awkward. I really enjoyed tonight, James said after a moment. You're special, Melissa. Melissa turned to him, her expression soft. I enjoyed it too, James. You're not what I expected when you first started at the hotel. James raised an eyebrow. Oh, what did you expect? She laughed lightly. Honestly, another guy just passing through, doing the job until something better came along. But you surprised me. You actually care about this place. About the people. James looked at her, his heart pounding. This was the moment. He could feel it. Slowly, he leaned in. Melissa didn't pull away. She met him halfway, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a soft, lingering kiss, one that spoke of unspoken feelings and new beginnings. When they finally pulled away, Melissa smiled. I guess this means tonight was a success. James grinned. I'd say so. They sat there a little while longer, wrapped up in the warmth of the moment. For the first time in his life, James wasn't thinking about money. business, or expectations. He was just a man, sitting under the stars with a woman who made him feel something real. And for him, that was more valuable than anything money could buy. In the days following their first date, James and Melissa's relationship deepened. Their connection felt natural, effortless, something James had never experienced before. They continued spending time together after work, sharing long walks, late-night talks, and quiet moments that spoke volumes. It was no longer just a workplace friendship, it was something real, something meaningful. One evening, as they sat in the hotel's garden, watching the sunset, James turned to Melissa with a thoughtful expression. "I'd love to meet your father," he said suddenly. Melissa looked at him in surprise. "You would?" James nodded. "Yeah, you've told me so much about him. And he seems like such an important part of your life. I think it's time I get to know him, too." Melissa smiled but hesitated for a moment. "My dad can be a little protective," she admitted. "He's always been cautious about the people I bring into my life." James chuckled. "I respect that. If he's anything like you, I'm sure he's a great guy." Melissa studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, how about Sunday? We can have lunch at my place." James agreed, feeling both excited and nervous. He wanted to make a good impression, after all. Melissa meant the world to him. When Sunday arrived, James dressed casually but neatly, wanting to look respectable but not overly formal. He grabbed a small bouquet of flowers, thinking it would be a nice gesture for Melissa's home. As he rode in a taxi to her house, his nerves built up. He had no idea what to expect, but he was ready. When he arrived at the modest yet welcoming home, Melissa greeted him at the door with a warm smile. "You made it," she said, taking his hand and leading him inside. James took a deep breath as he stepped into the living room, only to freeze in complete shock. Sitting on the couch, sipping a cup of coffee, was Edward. The same Edward who had become his mentor at the hotel. The same Edward who had given him life advice and guided him through his first real experience in the working world. The older man looked up, and the second their eyes met, Edward burst into laughter. James was too stunned to speak. "Edward, you're Melissa's father?" Edward, still chuckling, set down his coffee. "I told you, James, life is full of surprises." Melissa glanced between them, confused. "Wait, you two know each other?" James ran a hand through his hair, still processing what had just happened. "Yeah, we do. Edward has been like a mentor to me at the hotel. I had no idea he was your dad." Melissa's eyes widened. "And you never mentioned him?" Edward leaned back, clearly enjoying the moment. "Well, in my defense, I believe in keeping work and personal life separate." James let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "This is unbelievable." As they sat down for lunch, the conversation remained lively, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. James knew that, at some point, he had to tell them the truth. He had kept his real identity hidden for so long. And now that he was sitting at the same table as Melissa and Edward, two people who had come to mean so much to him, he couldn't lie anymore. Taking a deep breath, he set his fork down and looked at Edward and Melissa seriously. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice steady but filled with nerves. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am." Melissa frowned slightly, her smile fading. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, then continued. "Edward, you once told me that you knew Charles Adams, the man who owned the hotel chain." Edward nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. He was a great man." James inhaled deeply before saying the words that would change everything. "Charles Adams was my father. I'm his son. I'm the heir to the Adams hotel chain." A stunned silence filled the room. Melissa's face went pale as she processed what he had just said. Edward, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair and simply chuckled. "You've got to be kidding me," Melissa whispered, shaking her head. "All this time, you've been..." Edward, still smiling, reached for James's wallet. "Show me your ID, son." James hesitated but pulled it out, handing it to Edward. Edward studied it, then let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head with amusement. "You really do look like your father when he was young." James exhaled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I've been told that before." But while Edward took the news in stride, Melissa wasn't so calm. She stood up abruptly. her hands on the table. You lied to me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked up at her, guilt evident in his eyes. Melissa, I didn't mean to deceive you. I wanted to know what it was like to be treated like a regular person. I didn't want you to like me because of my name, my money, or my family. I wanted you to like me for me. Melissa swallowed hard, clearly struggling with the revelation. I understand why you did it, but that doesn't change the fact that you kept this from me. James nodded, standing up as well. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. Edward, ever the wise observer, cleared his throat. Melissa, I get that this is a shock, but let me ask you something. Has James ever treated you any differently than he does now? Has he ever acted like he was better than you? Melissa hesitated, then sighed. No, he hasn't. James took a step closer. Because it's real. Everything we've shared, everything I've felt for you, that was never a lie. Melissa looked at him, her expression softening, though the conflict in her eyes remained. I just need some time, she finally said, to process everything. James nodded, understanding completely. Take all the time you need. Edward, smiling as he observed the two of them, chuckled again. You know, James, your father would have loved this. He always believed that real love was about who you are, not what you have. James smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. The truth was finally out. Now, all that was left was to see if the love he had found with Melissa was strong enough to survive it. After the shocking revelation about James's true identity, Melissa needed space to process everything. The man she had grown close to, the one she thought she knew, had kept a massive secret from her. Though she understood why he had done it, it still hurt. She wasn't angry because he was wealthy, she was hurt because he hadn't trusted her with the truth. Edward, always the voice of reason, had advised her to take a step back and think before making any decisions. Sweetheart, love isn't about where someone comes from. It's about who they are. Has James ever made you feel small? Has he ever flaunted his wealth? Melissa shook her head. No, Dad, he hasn't. Edward smiled knowingly. Then ask yourself this. Do you love him? That was the real question. And deep down, she already knew the answer. James, on the other hand, spent the following days unsure of what to do. He understood why Melissa needed time. But waiting was excruciating. Every moment they had spent together had been real, he knew that. But had he ruined it by not telling her the truth sooner? One evening, as he sat on a bench in the hotel garden, Edward walked up and sat beside him. You've got that look, son. Edward sighed with a chuckle. James sighed. Yeah? And what look is that? The look of a man who's afraid he's lost something important. James rubbed his face. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted her to know me for who I am, not for my last name. Edward nodded. I get it, and for what it's worth. I think she does too. Just give her time. James appreciated the advice, but patience had never been his strong suit. He wanted to fix things, to make it right. So when Melissa finally asked to meet him at the park near her house, he wasted no time getting there. They sat on a bench, the air thick with unspoken emotions. I'm sorry, James said immediately. I should have told you sooner. Melissa held up a hand, stopping him. I know why you did it, James, and I get it, but you have to understand. It's hard to find out that the man I've been falling for is also the heir to a billion-dollar hotel chain. It makes me question if I even know you. James swallowed hard. You do know me, Melissa. Nothing about what we've shared has been fake. The way I feel about you, it has nothing to do with money or business. It's just, you. Melissa looked down at her hands, then back at him. I don't want to be with someone because of their money. I don't want a relationship built on status. I want something real. James reached for her hand gently. Then that's exactly what we'll have. She searched his eyes, and for the first time since the revelation, she smiled. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was something. It was hope. With things slowly mending between them, James decided it was time for Melissa to meet his family, specifically his mother, Linda. It was a big step, but if they were going to move forward, she needed to know where he came from. When he brought up the idea, Melissa hesitated. Are you sure your mom will like me? I mean, I'm just a hotel manager. She probably expects you to marry a model or a business mogul. James laughed. Trust me, my mom doesn't care about any of that. She just wants to see me happy. And you make me happy. That weekend, they took a flight to the city where the Adams mansion was located. Melissa had seen luxury before. Working in a high-end hotel exposed her to the wealthy all the time, but nothing prepared her for this. The mansion was breathtaking, a perfect blend of elegance and history. As they pulled up in a sleek car, Melissa's nerves kicked in. You okay? James asked, squeezing her hand. She took a deep breath. I think so. When they reached the front door, it swung open before James could even knock. Linda Adams stood there, poised and elegant, her sharp blue eyes immediately locking onto Melissa. For a second, Melissa felt intimidated. Linda exuded power and sophistication in a way that made it clear she was a woman used to running things. But then, her expression softened. You must be Melissa, Linda said, extending a hand. James has told me so much about you. Melissa shook her hand, surprised by how warm her grip was. It's really nice to meet you. Mrs. Adams. Please, call me Linda, she said with a small smile. Come in. Over lunch, Linda asked Melissa about her work, her background, and how she had met James. It was clear she wasn't just making small talk, she was assessing her. Melissa, to her own surprise, held her own. She spoke confidently about her career, her ambitions, and what she had learned from her father. At one point, Linda's expression changed. Your father, Edward, you mentioned he worked at the hotel? Melissa nodded. Yes, for years. Linda's lips curved into a nostalgic smile. I knew an Edward once. He was one of my husband's closest confidants. Melissa's eyes widened. Wait, you knew my father? Linda nodded. Yes, he was one of the few people my husband trusted completely. James and Melissa exchanged stunned glances. The connection between their families went deeper than they ever imagined. Linda chuckled. Well, I suppose fate has a funny way of working things out. By the time they left the mansion, Melissa felt lighter. Linda had not only accepted her, she had welcomed her. And knowing that her father had played a role in the Adams family history made things feel meant to be. As they boarded the plane back home, Melissa turned to James and smiled. Your mom's pretty amazing. James grinned. Told you. She took his hand in hers. I think we're going to be okay. James squeezed her fingers. Yeah, Melissa, we are. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, they both knew they were on the right path. With Melissa and James now fully reconciled and their relationship stronger than ever, things felt like they were falling into place. Their love had been tested, but they had come out the other side, closer than before. James had finally found someone who loved him not for his money or his family name, but for who he truly was. And now, he was ready for the next step, one he had never been more certain about in his life. The idea of proposing had been on James's mind for weeks, but he wanted to do it right. He had grown up in a world where elaborate engagements were the norm, flashy proposals at private islands, extravagant parties with hundreds of guests. But that wasn't what he wanted with Melissa. Their love wasn't about wealth or spectacle, it was about realness. He wanted his proposal to reflect that. One evening, as they walked hand in hand through the garden of the Adams family estate, James knew the moment had come. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the place, and everything felt perfect. Melissa, he said softly, stopping near a stone pathway lined with blooming roses. She turned to him with a smile. James took a deep breath. Before I met you, my life was empty. I had everything money could buy, but none of it mattered because I never had anyone to share it with. Then I came here, to this hotel, pretending to be someone I wasn't, and instead of finding what I thought I was looking for, I found something so much more. I found you. Melissa's breath hitched, her eyes widening as James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Dropping to one knee, he opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring. It wasn't the biggest or flashiest ring he could have bought, but it was perfect, classic, timeless, and full of meaning. Melissa, he continued, voice steady despite the nerves racing through him. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. You've shown me what it means to love and be loved for who I am, not what I have. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Melissa's eyes as she gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Yes, she whispered, before laughing as the words spilled out again. Yes. James slipped the ring onto her finger before standing up and pulling her into a deep, emotional embrace. You have no idea how happy you just made me, he murmured against her hair. Melissa pulled back slightly, her fingers tracing the edges of the ring. It's beautiful, James, but you know what? Even if you had proposed without a ring, I still would have said yes. James chuckled. Noted, but I'm still glad I got the ring. They stood there for a while, wrapped in each other's arms. As the last light of the sun faded into the horizon, it was the start of a new chapter, one they both knew would be the greatest adventure of their lives. With their engagement official, the next step was the wedding. James had expected planning a wedding to be stressful, but with Melissa, it felt easy. They both wanted something intimate yet elegant, something that celebrated their love without feeling like a corporate event. We should get married at the hotel, Melissa suggested one evening as they sat on their couch, flipping through a wedding magazine. James raised an eyebrow. Really? I thought you'd want some exotic destination wedding. Melissa shook her head, smiling. No, the hotel is where we met, where we fell in love. It's the start of our story. It just feels right. James thought about it and realized she was absolutely right. And so, the hotel where it all began was chosen as the wedding venue. Linda, thrilled to see her son so happy, took an active role in the planning, making sure everything was perfect. She and Melissa grew even closer through the process, bonding over floral arrangements, venue decor, and seating charts. Edward, of course, was emotional from the moment he found out about the engagement. You're going to make a wonderful husband, James, he said sincerely. And, Melissa, I couldn't have asked for a better man for my daughter. They chose a classic and elegant theme, with soft lighting, beautiful floral arrangements, and an intimate guest list of family, close friends, and some of the staff who had become like family. Melissa's dress was simple yet stunning, a flowing white gown with delicate lace details. She wanted something timeless, something that made her feel like herself. James, on the other hand, went with a classic black tuxedo, choosing a style similar to the one his father had worn on his wedding day, a quiet tribute to the man who had built the family empire. As the wedding day drew closer, the excitement grew. The hotel was transformed into a breathtaking venue, decorated with soft white roses and warm golden lighting. One night, as James and Melissa sat on the balcony of their apartment, looking out over the city, Melissa reached for his hand. I can't believe we're getting married, she said, shaking her head with a soft laugh. James smiled, bringing her hand to his lips. I can. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. She looked at him, her eyes filled with love. Do you ever think about how crazy this all is? How you came to the hotel, pretending to be someone else, and ended up finding everything you were looking for? James chuckled. Yeah, life's funny like that. Melissa sighed happily, leaning into him. I wouldn't change a thing. And neither would he. The countdown to the wedding had begun, and in just a few short weeks, they would finally say, I do. Neither of them could have imagined how their journey would unfold, but they both knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. After an unforgettable wedding filled with love, laughter, and heartfelt moments, James and Melissa finally had a chance to slow down and take in everything that had happened. Their journey from coworkers to soulmates had been unexpected, but standing at the altar and saying their vows had been the easiest decision either of them had ever made. Now, as husband and wife, they were about to embark on their next adventure, their honeymoon. Instead of an extravagant getaway to a private island or a 5-star resort, they chose something more personal, a countryside estate that had been in James's family for generations. The estate, tucked away in a picturesque valley surrounded by mountains and rivers, had once belonged to his late father, Charles Adams. It was a place filled with memories, history, and a quiet kind of beauty that felt perfect for their first days as a married couple. I wanted us to start our marriage somewhere peaceful, James had told Melissa as they packed their bags. Somewhere that feels real, not just another luxury trip. Melissa had smiled at him, touched by his thoughtfulness. That sounds perfect, James. Just the two of us, away from the world. The moment they arrived at the estate, Melissa was in awe. The house, A charming yet grand old manor was surrounded by rolling hills and a sparkling lake. Inside, the decor was timeless: high ceilings, antique furniture, and large windows that bathed the rooms in natural light. It felt like stepping into another world, one filled with stories from the past. The first few days were blissful. They spent their mornings having breakfast on the terrace, their afternoons exploring the land, and their evenings wrapped up in each other's arms, watching the stars. "This place feels magical," Melissa whispered one night as they lay on a blanket under the open sky. James kissed her forehead. "It does. And now, it's ours to make memories in." On their fourth day at the estate, while exploring one of the old storage rooms, Melissa noticed a dusty wooden chest tucked away in the corner. Intrigued, she called James over. "What do you think is inside?" she asked, brushing off some of the dust. James grinned. "Only one way to find out." He carefully pried open the chest, revealing stacks of old letters, yellowed photographs, and personal belongings from decades past. As they sifted through the contents, they quickly realized these weren't just random artifacts, they were pieces of James's family history. Melissa picked up a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "Look at this. It's addressed to your mom." James's brows furrowed as he untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded one of the letters. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to his father, Charles Adams. As he began reading, his heart pounded. The letter was a love note from Charles to Linda, written in the early days of their relationship. "My dearest Linda, every day I spend with you reminds me why I never want to walk this life without you. The hotels, the business, none of it matters if you aren't by my side. You are my home." James felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known his father as a sharp businessman, but this letter showed a different side of him, a man deeply in love, devoted to his wife. Melissa squeezed his hand. "Your dad really loved your mom." James nodded. "Yeah, he really did." They continued digging through the chest, finding more letters and photographs. One particular letter caught James's attention. It was addressed to Edward. Melissa leaned closer. "Your dad wrote to my father?" James's eyes scanned the words, realization dawning on him. The letter revealed that Edward had been more than just a trusted employee. He had been Charles Adams's close friend and confidant. "Edward, you have been like a brother to me. I don't know how I would have gotten through some of the toughest years without your wisdom and support. If anything ever happens to me, I trust you to look after my family the way I would." James sat back, stunned. "I never knew they were this close." Melissa wiped a tear from her cheek. "It's amazing. Our fathers had this deep bond. And now, here we are, married, creating our own story." Finding the letters changed everything for James. He had always known Edward as a kind, wise man, but now, he understood why he had felt such a strong connection to him from the very start. Edward had been more than just an employee. He had been part of the Adams family's journey. When they returned home from their honeymoon, the first thing James did was visit Edward. Sitting in Edward's cozy living room, James handed him the letter. "I found this at the estate." Edward adjusted his glasses, carefully reading the words. As he finished, he let out a long breath, his eyes glistening. "Your father was a great man, Edward Said," his voice thick with emotion. "He always saw people for who they were, not just their status. I owe a lot to him." James nodded. "I wish I had known how close you two were." Edward smiled. "Now you do. And now, you carry on his legacy, not just as a businessman, but as a man who values the people around him." Melissa, sitting beside James, reached for Edward's hand. "Your friendship meant so much to him, Edward, and it means so much to us, too." Edward squeezed her hand warmly. "That means more than you know, dear." That night, as James and Melissa lay in bed, he reflected on everything that had happened. "I spent so much of my life trying to figure out who I was without my family's name," James murmured. "But now, I realize, my past isn't something I need to run from. It's something I should embrace." Melissa ran her fingers through his hair. "You're not just an Adams, James. You're you. And that's who I fell in love with." James kissed her softly. "I love you, Melissa." She smiled. "I love you, too." As they drifted off to sleep, James felt at peace. He had spent so much time searching for something real, something meaningful, and he had finally found it. Not in wealth, not in power, but in love, family, and the history that connected them all. Life after the honeymoon felt richer, more meaningful. James and Melissa returned to their normal routine. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. They were no longer just two people figuring things out, they were a family now. Building something real together. The hotel, their home, their relationship, it all felt like a new beginning. But little did they know, life had one more surprise in store for them. A few weeks after their return, Melissa began feeling different. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe it was just the stress of adjusting back to work. But when the exhaustion didn't go away, and certain smells started making her feel nauseous, a thought crept into her mind. One evening, while James was in the living room reading over hotel reports, Melissa sat on the bed, staring at a small white stick in her hands. The pregnancy test. Her heart pounded as she turned it over and saw the result. Positive. She sucked in a breath, her mind racing. This wasn't something they had planned, at least. Not yet. But as the realization sank in, so did the overwhelming joy. She walked into the living room, the test still clutched in her fingers. James glanced up from his papers, his expression shifting the moment he saw her face. "Melissa?" he said, setting the documents aside. "What's wrong?" She let out a soft, nervous laugh and sat down beside him, taking his hand. "Nothing's wrong, James. In fact, something is very, very right." He looked down as she placed the test in his hand. His eyes widened as he processed the result. For a moment, there was silence. Then, his gaze shot back up to hers, filled with pure, unfiltered emotion. "Melissa, are we?" She nodded, her eyes misty with tears. "We're going to be parents." James let out a breathless laugh, then pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Oh my God, we're having a baby." Melissa giggled, the sound filled with joy and relief. "Yeah, we are." James pulled back slightly, placing a hand on her stomach. "I can't believe this. I mean, I knew I was the luckiest guy in the world when I married you. But this is everything." The next morning, they decided it was time to tell their families. Edward's reaction was exactly what Melissa had expected. He cried. Happy, proud, overwhelmed tears. "A grandchild," he whispered, pulling her into a hug. "I always knew you'd be an amazing mother, sweetheart." Linda, on the other hand, was radiant with excitement. "A baby? My first grandchild? Oh, this is the best news I've heard in years," she gushed, hugging them both tightly. That night, as they sat in their apartment, Melissa curled up beside James, her hand resting over his. "They're happy for us," she murmured. James kissed her forehead. "Of course they are. This baby is already so loved." As the months passed, their excitement only grew. James insisted on being part of every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, every little milestone. He was determined to be the best husband and father he could be. Melissa often caught him talking to her belly at night, whispering to their unborn child about how much they were loved and how excited he was to meet them. "Hey, little one," he would say, his hand gently resting on her bump. "Your mom and I can't wait to hold you. I promise, we're going to give you the best life possible." Melissa would listen, smiling softly, knowing their child had the best father in the world. Their apartment slowly transformed into a home for three. The guest room became a nursery, painted in soft, calming colors. A crib stood in the corner, surrounded by stuffed animals and baby books. Every little detail was carefully thought out, a reflection of the love they already had for the life growing inside Melissa. On a crisp early morning, it happened. Melissa woke up with a sharp pain in her stomach. At first, she thought it was nothing. But then the contractions came. "James," she gasped, clutching his arm. "It's time." James, already prepared, grabbed the hospital bag and rushed her to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of nerves, excitement, and anticipation. Hours passed, filled with tension, pain, and encouragement. James never left her side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering reassurances, his love unwavering. Then, finally, a baby's cry filled the room. James and Melissa looked at the tiny, wriggling newborn being placed in Melissa's arms, tears streaming down their faces. "Welcome to the world, little one," Melissa whispered, cradling their baby close. James kissed her temple. You did amazing, sweetheart. He's perfect. They had already picked the name, Charles Edward Adams. A name that carried the weight of two great men. Two fathers who had shaped their lives in ways they could never repay. Bringing baby Charles home was both exciting and terrifying. Sleepless nights, endless diaper changes, and the new reality of parenthood were overwhelming. But they wouldn't trade it for anything. Edward visited daily, absolutely smitten with his grandson. Linda, of course, spoiled the baby endlessly. James and Melissa found themselves looking at each other in the quiet moments. Exhausted but happy. One night, as James rocked Charles to sleep, Melissa watched from the doorway, her heart full. You're amazing with him, she whispered. James looked up, smiling. I just want him to grow up knowing how much he's loved. Just like we did. Melissa walked over, wrapping her arms around both of them. He's got the best father in the world. James pressed a kiss to her forehead. And the best mother. As they stood there, their son nestled safely in their arms. They knew this was what life was all about. Not wealth, not success, but family. And with that, their next chapter began. One filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a beautiful future together. At its core, this story is about love, identity, and the power of genuine connections. James spent his entire life surrounded by wealth but longed for something money couldn't buy, authenticity. By stepping away from his privileged world and experiencing life as an ordinary person, he discovered what truly mattered, the value of hard work, the importance of humility, and the depth of real love. Melissa, on the other hand, showed that love is not about status, power, or material wealth, but about trust, honesty, and the person behind the name. When she learned the truth about James, she had every reason to walk away, but she chose to look beyond his wealth and focus on the man she had fallen for. Their love story teaches us that real relationships are built on truth, not appearances. Beyond romance, the story also highlights the significance of family, legacy, and the unseen connections that bind people together. James and Melissa's families had been intertwined long before they met, proving that some relationships are simply meant to be. If you were in James's position, would you have hidden your identity to find real love? Or do you think honesty from the start is the best approach? And if you were in Melissa's shoes, would you have forgiven James for keeping such a big secret? We'd love to hear your thoughts. How would you handle a situation like this? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. Let's talk about love, honesty, and the choices we make in search of something real.